Great. Well, let's get going. Thanks everyone for joining us here today. As you may be aware, today is part of National Lead Poisoning Prevention Awareness Week, which really underscores the need to provide our children with safe drinking water, especially at school where they go to learn and play every day. Unfortunately, as more schools and daycares test for lead contamination, they're finding it. This health threat is present in all kinds of schools, including rural towns, urban areas, and affluent suburbs. In all likelihood, the confirmed cases of lead in schools' water are just the tip of the iceberg. That's because until 2014, national standards allowed fountains, faucets, pipes, and plumbing to contain a significant amount of lead. And wherever lead comes in contact with water, there's a risk of contamination. Here in Colorado, the legislature recently passed a bill, HB 22-1358, which mandates testing of drinking water in most childcare and daycare centers and schools K through 5, and provides funding for remediation for tests that return greater than 5 parts per billion. While this is a good step forward, the 5 part per billion threshold used in the bill is above what is recommended by major health institutions, including the American Academy of Pediatricians. And as our expert here today will explain in more detail, because lead contamination can ebb and flow within a water source, testing can fail to detect lead or the full extent of lead in the water. In order to fully protect our kids, the CoPIRG Foundation is launching our Filter First Colorado campaign this week to encourage Colorado school districts to adopt a filter first policy and replace all drinking water sources for all grade levels with lead removing filters. With major funding now available from both federal and state agencies, the opportunity for school districts to filter first and ensure kids have access to lead-free water is here. So today I'm fortunate enough to be joined by 2 experts in the field, Dr. Mark Anderson and environmental engineer Elin Batanzo. Dr. Anderson is a pediatrician in the Denver Community Health Services Department here in Denver, and is joining us today to speak about the risks of lead exposure for children. Dr. Anderson directs the Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit for Federal Region 8 and is an associate professor of pediatrics in the School of Medicine and Public Health at the University of Colorado. And his research and clinical interests include how the environment affects children's health, bridging medical disparities and environmental injustices, and taking healthcare out of the office to children directly. Thanks so much for joining us today, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you, Alex. Let me share my screen here. So I appreciate the opportunity to meet with you today. Thank you for your interest. This, I agree, is an important topic, so I'm happy to speak to it today. This is a vignette from a book called Toxic Truth, and it speaks to what lead intoxication for kids looked like a long time ago in the 1950s in the US. It's based on a real story. Fortunately, this doesn't happen nearly as much anymore, but it's a very concerning story. And the author, Lydia Denworth, writes a lot of science articles. She writes in Scientific American, and she has these, she writes books too. And this Toxic Truth was a good, fun read, and it's all about lead. So I'm a pediatrician. I work at Denver Health, and I also am privileged to be part of a national network called the PACES. Here's my disclaimer. And beyond the fact that the source funding for this program is the EPA and the CDC, I don't have any financial disclosures today. So here's what I'd like to quickly go through in just a few minutes. 3 champions are displayed on the right. I'll introduce them as we go through the talk. But talk a little bit about what lead does to kids, go through past public health interventions, including some related to water, and the effect that had on blood lead levels in kids, go through the screening recommendations for kids around lead, and to understand some of the basic epidemiology of lead exposure in our area, and I'll show you some local data as well. But to begin with, let's tackle something that's a little complicated. So these are blood tests on kids. They're expressed as micrograms per deciliter. So what exactly does that mean? Just so we all understand. So with apologies to Matt Groenig, we see deciliters expressed as bottles for each size of baby up to an adult.
Oh, Dr.
So
Anderson,
one of
sorry,
those bottles is 500 cc's, half a liter, also 5 deciliters. So 6 to 10-month-old you would expect would have about about 5 deciliters of blood circulating in the body. Upper left, you see a sugar packet.
Hey, Dr. Anderson, I hate to interrupt you, but we're still looking at the first slide of your screen of your
Oh
presentation.
gosh, sorry about that.
No problem. Just wanted to make sure the visual is keeping up.
Well, I don't know what's going on then. Are you still looking at the first slide?
Yes, we still are. I don't know if it's possible to maybe select it along the left-hand side.
Is that better there?
Nope, it's still showing that big first one, although it looks like along the left-hand side of your screen, we can see small versions of the slides, so you might be able to.
You might be sharing not the slideshow version. You might be advancing on a different screen if you have more than one screen open
Oh
right
gosh, let me try to share again in here. Let's see here. Sorry about that. Is that any better there?
Let's see. You stopped sharing your screen, so you could try just resharing again.
Okay. You know, 3 years of this in the pandemic, you'd think it'd be easier to do these things.
Yeah, I think everyone's pretty familiar with rolling with these punches.
Okay. So here is, I'll share again. So
There
what
we
are you
go. We
seeing?
see a sugar packet in The Simpsons.
Okay, is that still there?
Yep.
Okay. So again, size of body makes a difference. So the baby on the left has a little bit less blood than the adult does on the right. And then look at the sugar packet up top. That's 2.8 grams. So we're talking about micrograms per deciliter. So doing a little bit of math, about 1/100th of this sugar packet would get you to a level of 5.6 micrograms per deciliter if this was lead. And then off on the right, you see paint chips. Lead paint is not sold in the US anymore, but it still exists in many of our homes. So you can imagine it doesn't take much lead containing paint chips that a kid eats to actually drive a level up pretty high. And along the bottom, I have some examples of cases that I've dealt with. So on the left, we see a bathtub, and lead glazing was used quite a bit in bathtubs. And I can think of one kid who would take a bath in a bathtub and would drink a lot of the water that was in this lead glazed bathtub, and that would drive his level up high enough to where you can actually detect elevated levels in his blood. All right. And now I'm not advancing. Oh gosh. I'm so sorry about this. Let me try one more time. It might be easier if I just do this. Let's see here. Okay, are you looking at the screen with the Simpsons again? Yes, I see a nod. Okay.
Yep.
So I'm just going to do this. And oh, wow. So we've gone on to another slide that says lead effects, why worry? So
Yep.
sorry for all the vernacular here, but if you see this this bracelet in the middle, this was sold as a free gift with a pair of Reeboks. And it was a kid, I believe, from Minnesota who got a hold of this bracelet and was chewing on it like a chew toy. And that kid had very elevated lead levels. It was found by doing a blood test on this kid, and it was not known that this bracelet actually had lead until this particular kid showed up. So that's the public health aspect of this. Stuff comes into the country, it gets sold, and it may or may not contain lead until you see a kid who has an elevated lead level. And on the right, I've expressed some of the things you might see in people as their lead levels go up. And it's not until you get very high levels that you begin to see stuff that physically looks abnormal, like high blood pressure or acting abnormal, like the kid in the vignette that was in my first slide. First champion, Herb Needleman. I can't do him justice quickly, but one of the pioneers of lead research in kids, and over his clinical lifetime, he actually witnessed almost an 80% decrease in the average lead level in kids. So very active clinician. He suffered professionally because of the lead paint industry attacking him for things that he was saying. Turns out he was spot on and was exactly right, and we owe a lot to him. Here's some of the public health interventions that have occurred over the years in the US. Lead as an issue is not new. In Europe, there was activity in the 1800s to help abate lead exposure. The US lagged quite far behind. But here in 1978, we see the ban on residential paint. The blue bars show what blood lead levels were in kids on average at that time. So as you follow this graph off to the right, which gets us over to 2008, we see that in 1986, there's a ban on lead in plumbing. So even though the substance is banned, you might imagine that it still exists in the infrastructure that water is flowing through. But the average blood lead level has decreased markedly over these years to where it's really a small portion of what it was back in the 1970s. So we're now in an era where we focus on low lead levels, and this is from an era when the action level, the level that was considered abnormal for lead, was something around 10 micrograms per deciliter. And I already shared that you can't look at a kid and know that they have a level that's 10 without doing a blood test on them. One of the early researchers and the second champion, Bruce Lanphier, he pioneered the idea that low lead levels actually have an effect on how kids do. In this case, it's on intellect. And he was one of the first to be able to represent that as you drive up blood lead levels, even at low levels, that you can see decreases in IQ. So for example, a 1 point increase in blood lead, 1 microgram per deciliter, is correlated with a 1 point decrease in mean reading scores. So 10 points increase would be a 10-point decrease in reading IQ. So these do get significant at higher levels. There were some criticisms of his report, so he did it a little bit differently. He studied it going forward in time or prospectively. He was able to show the same sorts of findings. So increasing a child from 1 microgram to 10 micrograms on average decreased their IQ by 7.4, which is significant for kids. If you want to hear more about Bruce Lanphier and his current activities, this Little Things Matter, it's a wonderful short video to watch that speaks to his current work, focused mostly on environmental justice and the effects lead has on kids who are poor. So some local data. So Denver Health, where I work, we can ask of our system what lead screening looks like. We're a pretty good screener for lead. We screen at 1 and 2 years of age, using 5 as the level at which we would call high. In this data set, which is over 4 years from 2016 to 2019, we had 340, or about 2.5% of our kids that score 5 and above. We're lucky in Denver, where we have a good partnership with the city. Denver Environmental Public Health can go out to homes and actually do an assessment to see if they can't find the source of the lead for the kids that we're checking. Here's some of their data. I have the graph up top that says then. So this is about 20-year-old data, and it speaks to what they identified as the source of elevated lead levels in the kids whose home they had gone to. And we see paint deteriorating, repairing or remodeling soya or pica soil. Pica is abnormal eating, so kids eat things that aren't nutritious. That's called pica. But those 4 left, you can see, explain the vast majority of these cases. We don't really see water appear here necessarily. So those left 4 all mean paint. So paint is the original source of those. And then now, so this is data from about 4 or 5 years ago. We see this large purple bar on the left, outside sources. So this is mostly our refugee population in Denver. So they're coming into the United States. They're being seen at some sort of a healthcare facility. They bring the lead in their bodies, having been contaminated from other parts of the world where they came from. So now modern champion, this gets to lead in water. So this is Mona Hana Atisha. She's a pediatrician in the upper Midwest. She was noticing some years ago in her kids that she seemed to be seeing a little bit higher lead levels than she was used to. And so she did a little research and she published the study that I note there. And this was the beginning of what is called the Flint lead water crisis. So here's a map of Michigan. Note where the Flint River is, and then the city of Flint right there, and then Detroit, lower right part of Michigan, and then Lake Huron. So Flint as a city is post-industrial. It's devastated economically. It was actually a ward of the state budgetarily. They were looking for ways to save money. One of the ways they found to save money was to use a more local water source, which was from the Flint River, instead of from Detroit water, where it had been previously. Flint's an old city. It's water going through old infrastructure. And the Flint River water is a little different than the Detroit water in that it's a little more acidic, and it tends to pull lead out of pipes and solder more so than the Detroit water. And this was the source of the Flint water crisis, where kids were exposed to and contaminated by lead at numbers beyond what they should have been. Purely an economic decision. And this is Dr. Hanatisha's publication, Pay Attention to the Red Box. So there were kids already living in an environment where the lead levels in water were a little bit higher, but you see that their levels in their blood more than doubled as a result of this crisis. So 10.6 on average, anyone today would consider that an elevated blood level, and we would try to do something about it. Some local data, and this is from Denver Water. So on the lower right, I show the Denver Water's catchment area. Above that, we see a heat map. So the blue and darker blue is where there's increased density of homes that may have older lead service pipes. Denver Water, as you may know, is actively engaged in a program to replace these service pipes. But because there are places where there's older infrastructure and lead-containing service pipes, they've conditioned the water in a way such that it won't leach as much lead out. So they're applying a service-wide intervention to target these few homes. And it's actually 72,000 at last count. And this graph is from a couple of years ago, but you can see by zip code the numbers of these potential lead service pipes. You can go to denverwater.org and put in your address and see if your home has an older service pipe. Kudos to Ann Schumke, who wrote about this recently in the legislation that we're discussing here today. So in thinking about schools testing their water, one, has the water been tested at all? And what barriers it really exist to remediation? And the schools, I think, they're risk averse in terms of cost that might be encumbered as a result of knowing that elevated lead levels exist. This is our most vulnerable population. This is kids. So they're going to be exposed for a lifetime after this exposure. The best thing to do is to avoid the exposure together. And then I asked sort of, parenthetically, what would parents want for their kids? And I think they would want water that doesn't have any lead in it. And that is my last slide. Sorry about the technical issues.
No problem at all. Thanks so much for that presentation. That was really informative and really value the data for Denver and Colorado as well. That's really interesting. So now I'd like to introduce our next expert, environmental engineer Elin Patanzo from Safe Water Engineering. Elin has over 20 years of experience working on drinking water science, engineering, and policy issues. She's the founder of Safe Water Engineering, LLC, which is a consulting firm working to improve access to safe drinking water through engineering. In August of 2015, Elin played a critical role in uncovering the Flint water crisis that Dr. Anderson just spoke about, and she worked directly with that doctor, Dr. Hanatisha, to conduct a study that discovered elevated levels of lead in the children in Flint, Michigan. She continues to work on lead and drinking water policy at the federal, state, and local levels. So thanks so much for joining us today, Elin.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to sharing my slides. And let's see if that's working the way. Does it look like a slide?
It looks perfect.
Okay, thank you. I live in Michigan. I've been working in Michigan, and we've been working on water quality in our schools for a few years, looking at an approach to get lead safe drinking water in our schools. And we call this the filter first approach. And so I'm going to talk about drinking water in our schools and what my experience has been in Michigan. And so we've got, as Dr. Anderson just reviewed, there's so many sources of lead exposure. But one issue with water is we need to drink it every day to survive. And so it's one of these things, if you're getting lead through your drinking water, you can be consuming it every day. It could be in your home, in your school. And that's why it's very important to address this exposure and prevent it as much as possible. Unlike most of our drinking water contaminants that are usually in our source water and we can remove them from at a water treatment plant, lead is rarely found in our source water. Lead typically comes from plumbing materials and lead service lines. And when the water passes through those plumbing materials containing lead, the lead leaches into the water and then we drink it in our glass. So in individual homes, the source of lead is frequently lead service lines. It can also come from household plumbing, fittings, and fixtures. In schools, the service lines tend to be larger because these are larger buildings, larger capacity. So lead service lines are not quite as frequent in schools, but we can find them in, especially in in-home daycares and smaller school buildings or schools with multiple service lines. But the lead in schools primarily comes from plumbing and fixtures. And so the lead in school plumbing can come from a variety of different sources. And we have what's called this definition of lead-free plumbing. And it was revised in 2014. After 2014, any plumbing materials that were installed had to meet this new definition of lead-free, which means it contains 0.25% lead by weight or less. And so you heard that right. Lead-free plumbing actually, by definition, contains lead. But up until 2014, plumbing materials could be marked lead-free and contain up to 8% lead by weight. And that is a lot of lead, and that still exists in our schools today, and it leaches into the water. Lead solder was banned in 1986, but lead solder is still used for a variety of other applications, and we still see it cropping up here and there in plumbing applications. So it is possible for lead solder to be improperly used in drinking water applications still today. As I said before, there can be lead service lines, but they're not quite as frequent in schools as they are in individual homes. Plumbing materials not intended for drinking water use. If plumbing materials weren't intended for drinking water, they can have any level of lead whatsoever. There's no limits on it. So think laboratory faucets, hose bibs, garden hoses. If they're filling the water coolers for the football team, don't do it through a hose bib and a garden hose because those materials could contain very high levels of lead in them. We also find lead in schools in pre-1988 drinking water coolers with lead-lined tanks. So at our water treatment plants, many of them use corrosion control treatment, and that is intended to reduce the amount of lead that dissolves into the water. It forms a protective coating on the plumbing materials, and the water has to keep passing through those plumbing materials to be effective. A lot of our schools have intermittent schedules, and so that corrosion control doesn't build up the way it does with regular water use like we have in our own homes. So think weekends with no water use, week-long school breaks, no water use, month-long summer breaks with no water use. When you keep interrupting the flow of water in the school building, it means that corrosion control coating cannot build up and protect students from lead in their water. And what that we find is when we test for lead in school water, we tend to find it. And so I'm presenting some data here that I did not have to go far to find. It's actually from my own children's elementary school here in Birmingham, Michigan. The school district decided to do a voluntary lead sampling program, and it illustrates a lot of concepts about lead in water. Lead release in water is sporadic. A one-time test doesn't tell you everything you need to know about the risk of lead from an individual location. And just replacing a fixture doesn't necessarily get you the safe water that you want. Where I'm looking at the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendation of 1 part per billion. So back in 2016, we took a lot of lead samples in this elementary school building where both my children were attending at the time. And but at the time they were looking at a trigger level of 15 parts per billion. And in their first round of sampling, they found that the majority of these sites had a lead level lower than that. They selected a handful of sites to do resamples. And as you see here, 4 sites tested higher in the repeat sample, a few sites tested lower. But one of these sites, really pops out. Its original sample was at 6.3 parts per billion, and then it retested at 140 parts per billion. Same faucet, no change, a high, very extremely concerning level of lead. They replaced that faucet, put a brand new post-2014 lead-free faucet in there, and they still got a sample back at 3.5 parts per billion. So that's not the response that we want. We want to get that lead as low as possible, especially when our children are drinking it every day. And so that's why we're looking at the filter first approach in Michigan. We actually have bills in Michigan. They've passed the Michigan Senate. We're waiting for them to get passed in the House. We have funding to install filter stations in our schools. And so a filter first strategy focuses on providing safe drinking water first, provide the safe water now, and then rely upon testing to ensure that those filters are working and make sure there's a maintenance plan. So it's installing filter stations at a ratio of 1 to 100 students, making sure that there is a plan for maintaining those. The filter stations need to have certified filters that are certified to meet NSF standard 53 for lead reduction and standard 42 for particulate removal. And so in Michigan, the bill that we're working on right now is having testing once per year after the filters are installed to ensure that they are performing as intended and meeting all those certification requirements. And then there's some triggers with that sampling. If something goes wrong, there's remediation if the filtered water still contains lead. Now, in my school district, we've actually been able to implement this filter first approach, and we have filtered bottle fillers in all of our schools where that's where the kids drink their water. We still have taps for hand washing, but those are for hand washing only. We're managing a much smaller number of drinking water outlets, and every single water sample since they've installed the filter stations have been non-detect for lead. We did a cost analysis for the Michigan plan. And what we found is that providing safe drinking water first using the filter first approach actually costs less over 10 years than continuing to sample, trying to replace faucets, and hoping that the kids get safe water. With a filter first strategy, we know we're getting safe water because we know that the water kids are drinking is filtered. But as you can see here in this cost presentation, the this 10% bar here is if we're testing water taps throughout the school and then replacing about 10% of faucets per year, trying to get rid of the lead. And then this cost bar is if you're replacing 40% of fixtures per year to try to get rid of that lead. And so I find this pretty compelling that it costs less and it provides an immediate source of safe water for children to drink in their schools. So we're hopeful that that will get passed this year, and we'll be able to move forward to have that available for all the schools in the state of Michigan.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elin. And that's great to see Michigan moving forward with a filter first bill. But we know that, for all school districts, the major hurdle towards adopting these types of big facility improvements is how to pay for them. And luckily, significant funding is now available from both federal and state agencies for school districts in Colorado, creating a really unprecedented opportunity for school districts to go ahead and filter first and ensure that the drinking water they're providing for their kids is lead-free. School districts can take advantage of a few different funding sources. One is known as ESSER 3 funds. Those are provided to schools as part of the American Rescue Plan Act in 2021. And a portion of them can be used to fund reducing exposure to environmental health hazards, such as lead. There's also an EPA grant school districts can apply to for lead removal, as well as funding available through the recent state bill. With this unprecedented array of resources currently available to Colorado school districts, there's a real opportunity to transition away from the old test and chase method of reducing lead exposure to filter first, which is really the only way we know we can ensure the drinking water kids are drinking every day at school is lead free. As part of that campaign, We at CoPIRG recommend school boards take a few actions. First and foremost, pass a filter first resolution and commit to replacing all water fountains with hydration stations equipped with lead removing filters within the next 1 to 2 years. Install lead removing point of use filters on all of their taps used for cooking and drinking. Clearly mark sinks that are not filtered as hand wash only. And after preventative steps are taken, test the taps to ensure levels of lead do not exceed 1 part per billion, the limit recommended by the American Academy of Pediatricians. Children in Colorado have been exposed to lead in their drinking water for far too long. We have the facts, we have a simple technology that can remove lead from water, and we have the funding. So now it's time for school boards to act. We have a few minutes. If anyone has any questions, you can feel free to post them in the Q&A. And without seeing anything there, please feel free, if you have a question for me or either of our experts today, to reach out to me. I'd be happy to put you in touch with them. And thank you everyone for joining us today for this important topic. We really appreciate it. Have a wonderful rest of your day.